One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give this person your seat." Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." That's God's word for today. Friends in Jesus Christ, one of my most distinctive memories as a kid sitting in church many years ago was seeing somebody walk into the church right before the service started, who was a little scruffy looking, long hair. The guy with long hair, which in that day wasn't so common. And he came up, we'd never seen him before, and he sat right next to a woman who was a respected, well-liked lady in our church. And what I remember is how just a few, maybe a minute after he sat down, she scooched over one chair away from him. Now, I have no idea why she did that. Maybe she was, maybe he smelled bad, I don't know. Maybe he said something to her. Or maybe she felt sincerely that she would be distracted by him and she wouldn't be able to follow the message or the worship service. I don't know, but to me, that looked bad. That looked awful. And I still remember that to this day. I felt that's not who we are to be. In our scripture today, we read that Jesus went to a house of a very prominent Pharisee, probably quite a leader in that day. And he went there for a meal. Don't you love how often Jesus ate in the Bible? I mean, he was always around food, whether it was a meal, a banquet, or a party, something that brought food out. And that's one way I know I can really relate to him. And at this particular time, well, actually, at all meals of that day, they sat in couches with low tables, and I want you to picture that kind of in a U shape or horseshoe shape. At one end, at the front, would be a couch where the host would sit, and they sat in the order of social importance. So how important you were, how connected you were to the host, determined where you sat. And so you had a couch here, and right next to the host would be people on his left. I think the left side went first, and then the right side, and in order of how important they were, whether it was as a religious leader, or as a wealthy person, or as somebody who was connected to the government or the military, whatever it was. That's how you determined where you sat. So there'd be couches on this side and on this side, and people would sit in order of their social importance. That's just the way it was done. That's what people did back then. And Jesus looks at them, and he notices how people are kind of jostling for position, you know? They're elbowing each other, or they're bumping into each other. Maybe they're kind of pushing each other away so that they can get, closer to the host, so that they can sit and be looked at as they were more important than other people. And he says to them, when he sees this, he tells them a parable. He says, when you are invited somewhere, and Luke calls this a parable, when you're invited somewhere, don't try to sit in the place of honor. Don't try to get up closer to the host. No, because if you do that, it could happen that someone else comes in that's more important than you, and the host has to tell that person to sit in your place, and you will be humiliated, and you will have to sit at the end. No, he says, don't do that. Rather, just go to the end to begin with. Just sit in that place where you are not considered important, and then maybe the host will come along and tell you, hey, I want you to move up a little bit closer to me. And then you will feel a lot better. You won't be so humiliated. And it all brings us to verse 11, which says, can you bring up one more slide, please, Raj? Which says this, for all those who exalt themselves will be humbled. All those who want to get up close will be humbled. And all those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, Luke says this is a parable. And some of you know, definition of a parable is that parables were earthly stories with heavenly meanings. They were ordinary stories that were told with a deep spiritual meaning. And in this case, Jesus uses the context of where they were to make this statement, to use this ordinary situation, this ordinary circumstance, to teach something about God. And what parables actually often did, they did unexpected things. They often would end with something very unexpected, and they were used generally to teach people about the kingdom of God, about God's ways, and about how God's ways are not the ways of the world, are not our ways. How God in his kingdom actually, very often, turns things upside down, right? God's ways are just the opposite often of what we would expect. We think that these kind of people are important. And God comes along and says, no, 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 no. In my kingdom, in the way that I look at people, at people's importance, at who belongs, it's just the opposite. And actually, underneath it all is the idea of grace, right? Of God's grace. God gives his grace to us. It's not what we do or how much money we have or who our family is or what we've accomplished or how involved we are in the community or whatever it may be. It's about God's grace to us. But it makes me wonder, when I look at this story, when I think about how people are wanting to be closer, they're wanting to be recognized, right? They're wanting to be important. They're striving to be noticed. I wonder about us today. I wonder about myself. Do I have some of those tendencies? And specifically, do I struggle with pride? Do I yearn to be like them in some ways? I mean, kind of natural in some ways, right? I mean, we think to ourselves, we get into this, we think to ourselves, whoa, I'm better than that person. Huh? I mean, look at my grandkids. Look how they behave, how good they are. They're better than so-and-so's grandkids, you know. Or we think, I don't drink, you know, like those people, like those neighbors over there. I'm better than they are. We think, oh boy, so-and-so, they don't know as much as me. I'm really, you know, better than them. Or we think, I'm more important than so-and-so because look what I'm doing for God. Look at how much I'm doing. You know, how involved I am at my church or in my neighborhood or wherever it is. Look how much I've done in my life, how much I've accomplished, and boy, I'm better than so-and-so. I mean, many of us have heard that pride is the root of all sin, and yet we struggle with it, right? In fact, I think we probably all do in some way or another. I feel that there's often so much that puts us down in life, so much that makes us feel inadequate, so much that makes us feel bad about ourselves, or maybe that makes us feel limited. Understandably so. We can't do what we used to do. We can't articulate ourselves as well. We can't physically accomplish such and such. We feel bad about ourselves, and so naturally we kind of want to make up for it a little bit. We kind of want to let people know, no, that's not me. I'm this person who's done this and who's accomplished that, and who has more. We often feel like a character named Curved Brick that I heard about in a modern day parable. You see, Curved Brick was lying in a big heap of bricks being used in the construction of a church. Some of the other bricks, and you know how they can be, we're talking about Curved Brick, saying he wasn't as good as them, saying he just didn't fit in with them. And then a workman came along and saw Curved Brick and said, this one isn't good for anything. And he took Curved Brick and he threw him in a heap of trash. Throw him in trash heap, making Curved Brick feel bad about himself. Thinking maybe I'm no good after all. I mean, maybe I'm not even a brick. Maybe I'm just a paperweight or a bookend. And you know, sometimes I feel like Curved Brick. And what do I do when I feel that way? I either act like I know more than I do, kind of make me feel superior to other people, or I feel bad about myself. I even withdraw because I don't think I know enough. I don't think I'm as smart as someone else or good enough to do what they're doing. And what I learned this week was that the Greek word for humble is tapenos, which actually conveys the idea of having the right, or having a right view of ourselves. Not a prideful view, no, not a prideful view, but also not I'm a terrible person kind of view either. I'm not worthwhile. I'm negative. I'm a wretched worm, or whatever else we might think of ourselves as at times. It's the idea that we see in Romans 12, where it says, "For by the grace given to me, I say to every one of you not to think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but rather to think with sober judgment about yourself. One translation interprets that last phrase this way, but rather be honest in your evaluation of yourself. And then it says, measuring yourself by the faith, the love, the grace that God has given us. Don't have a negative view of yourself. Don't have too high a view of yourself. But have a right view of yourself. And in fact, in the Bible, when we read about humility, we hear that it's not to live out of an idea of self-importance, but rather to live the way God calls us to live. To live in a way that shows our dependence on God. Isn't that something? Isn't that wonderful? I mean, we're God's creatures. We are. We're dependent on God. But we're limited even. We're just so small in some ways compared to God. But at the same time, we're God's children. We're both creatures and children of God. And as children, we are special. We have a purpose. We are loved. We have God with us in all that we do. We're gifted by God to do things for His glory. Creatures and children of God. And then that brings me to the rest of the story. Jesus has spoken to the guests. And now what does He do? He turns to the host in this story. And He tells the host, you're inviting the wrong people. When you give a meal or a banquet, don't invite your friends, family members, or rich neighbors. In fact, it mentions 4 different sets there. Friends, brothers or sisters, relatives, or rich neighbors. And then it says, instead, invite another set of 4. Poor, crippled, the lame, and the blind. The description kind of is meant to encompass all of those that might make you feel important. And who can repay you. And the other set of 4 conveys the idea of all of those who cannot repay you. All of those who are too poor, or too needy, or too hurting, or too downcast, outcast, and are not able to advance your status. Because He said, after all, that's what you're doing. You're just inviting those who can make you look good, rather than to invite those who really need it and who cannot repay you. Jesus makes abundantly clear that His kingdom is different, doesn't He? Who's important in His kingdom is not those who are important in this world, but who's important in His kingdom are generally those who are looked down on by God, by others, and not by God. When I think about this, I realize that churches like yours here are often a lot more blessed than people think. Right? I suspect that you, as a church, you've often focused not on status or reaching out to those who would make you wealthy and make you look good, but rather, I suspect you focus more on caring for the poor, caring for those in need, caring for those who are disabled, those who are struggling with mental health, those who are hurting, those who are in relationships that are really, really, really hard. And through it, you are being blessed by God more than many people think. Not just to mention your long history of the ways this church has been a blessing. I grew up in the Walnut Creek area, and I, as a little boy, would come to this church sometimes. Every once in a while, we would come, and I remember back in those days, I don't know if anyone was here then, but Reverend Marley, and you would have 2 services right back to back. You'd have a service, and then a meal, and then another service. And for me, whoa, that was a lot, all in that time. But you've touched so many people in history, and now today as well. I suspect you are being blessed for right now, because you're focusing on God's kingdom, on who God cares the most about, those who are in need. It's like the way that modern day parable of curved brick ends. This is you. It ends this way. You see, curved brick was laying in that trash heap, wondering if he was any good, wondering if he had anything to contribute. But somehow, deep down, he knew that he belonged. He knew that he should be a part of the building. And then, wouldn't you know it, architect, the great designer of that church, visited the work site. The workmen had asked him to come to explain part of the plans, because something just wasn't going right as they were trying to build this. And when he saw their problem, what did he do? He asked for curved brick. He went over, frustrated with the workers, and rescued curved brick from that trash heap. Curved brick couldn't believe it. Architect himself took him and set him in place in that building, saying, I personally designed this brick to fit right here. I personally designed this person to do what I called him or her to do. Not what the world sees as important. Not what the world even notices, right? Oftentimes. I personally designed this church, this group of people, this congregation, in a certain way where they are to be able to do things that no one else can do in this community and for one another. Brick is kind of like me. Maybe I'm a little different shape than some people. Maybe I'm not seeing all that as all that important or valuable. But I know that I'm important to God. I know you're important to God and His upside down kingdom. Those who are humble and unselfish, they will be exalted. You know, today, I could talk a lot about this as well, but I'm just going to mention it today. Today is the 59th anniversary of what? Anybody know? It's the 59th anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. When, for a couple of days, people had marched on Washington for jobs and freedom. And they ended up there on the 28th of August. And what, over 200,000 people? Whoa. And Martin Luther King gave that speech, that's known today as I Have a Dream. And that passionate dream, calling for, that passionate speech, calling for equality of all people, calling for, jobs and for opportunities for all. And part of that dream, he says this. I love this. It comes from Scripture. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. What made Martin Luther King so effective? I mean, whatever else you can say about him, his speaking ability, his contagious, friendly, caring personality, at the bottom of it all, or at least two of the things that were at the bottom of it all, were no doubt his humility and his unselfishness. The things that we're seeing addressed in this parable today. He would say things like this in his writing: I hope that circumstances will soon make it possible for me to meet each of you, not as an integrationist or a civil rights leader, not as someone important, but rather as a Christian brother. And he would talk about, when I die, he would even say this: I don't want a long eulogy. I don't want people to say what great things, has happened through me. I don't want any of that kind of stuff. What I want you to do is to say that I was someone who tried to feed the hungry. I did what I could in my life to clothe the naked. What I did in my life was to visit those in prison. I want you to say that I tried to love and serve other people. God works amazing things. Sometimes things that we can all see, and sometimes things that we don't see, but amazing things nonetheless, through those who are humble and those who are not selfish, who live by God's grace and who give that grace to others. So I want to just conclude by asking you to think today about how can you pursue, how can we pursue humility and unselfishness in our lives? What would that look like? I mean, maybe this is a conversation that can have with some of you afterwards, or you can have with each other this week. But yeah, we can do things, and we need to do things like we've done in the service, right? Confess our sins. Confess them regularly. Pray for God to help us grow in humility and unselfishness. Pray for the needs of others and ask God to help us serve them, right? Maybe also choose not to be offended by others. A lot of times our pride comes up when we feel offended. We got to defend ourselves. Also by obviously clearly reaching out to those who are poor and more vulnerable than we are. People in our community, people that we know, in our families, others, orphans, people with special needs, single moms, those who have been abused, and on and on. You know what I'm talking about today. You know who God has a special heart for in your life, in your neighborhood, just like I know that I'm called to reach out to, that I'm called to be closer to, in the eyes of the world, at the end of the table, but in the eyes of God, right up next to Jesus. So think about this. And then I want to conclude today in the kind of the way I began. I began with that story of the guy coming in and sitting next to the woman. Well, I want to end with a similar story, one that I read about. I didn't see this one, but I read about this happening in a church that was really kind of fancy. I uppity even, well-to-do. I mean, it did everything just right, and everything just so. And one day people saw this guy come in. Other guy, kind of unkempt, kind of straggly, kind of, in fact, clothes were, people that sometimes we see walking around our neighborhoods, right? And just somebody who, whoa, what are you doing in here? Saw this person walking in, down the back aisle of this fancy church, starting to walk up, and people are noticing. And according to the author of this story, who told about it, he said people were even asking themselves, What's he doing here? Don't let that person come in. And then he says they saw an elderly, respected gentleman in the church get up out of his seat and go over to the man. And some people are thinking, good, escort him out of here. Good for you. Take care of him so that we don't have to be bothered by this guy right now. But what does that elderly, respected man do? I mean, he's actually, I think, if I remember correctly, he had a cane that he was using. He took the man in his hand, took his hand, and he walked all the way up the aisle with him, and then sat on the floor with him before the cross of Jesus. God calls us, you and me, to show his kingdom, to respond to his grace and his love for us, his making us his children, by living in an unexpected way, in a way that shows just how great his love is for all. Amen. Our song of response